Korean War. We had an existential threat, right? We had nukes pointed at each other. We had, drills in schools, kids hiding under desks. I mean, what the fuck? So, with the fear that the Chinese or the Soviets were going to develop mind control abilities was pervasive, and it's sound. You talk about it now, and everybody rolls their eyes and goes, "Oh my God!" But you're absolutely right that you have to understand the context in which then Alan Dulles, who was at the time the director of the CIA,
by the way, the guy who Kennedy fired,
yes,
and wound up being a part of the Warren Commission after Kennedy was murdered, which was very strange.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. I like where that could go. So anyway, we got Alan Dulles, who in '53, early in '53, says, "All right, we have to understand what the Soviets are doing, particularly the Soviets. But we also had, again, I'm sure some folks listening know all this, but a lot of folks probably don't. We had POWs returning, American POWs returning from Korea. That was a big issue, right, because some of them came back, again, quote unquote, brainwashed, and some of them didn't want to return because, brainwashing, mind control that, perhaps the Chinese had developed these techniques. So initially the idea was defensive. How do we protect ourselves against this new threat within this Cold War, against these enemies who appear to be devoting a great deal of resources against this? Well, so initially it started out as a defensive effort. MK Ultra was the umbrella name for a whole bunch of over 140 projects, sub-projects underneath MK Ultra. And it was all based around chemical substances, use of chemicals, use of drugs, behavioral issues with human beings, creating false memories, deleting memory, influencing the behavior again of individuals. There were a variety of projects that fell under this MK Ultra, and it was again starting out as a defensive issue, but then quickly became sort of an offense. How do we become the leader in all of this? Which is typical, right? It's typical in how things develop. It's like cyber warfare. Initially it's defensive, and now you think, okay, now we gotta figure out how to make it work on our behalf.
And sometimes it's important, like when they shut down the Iran nuclear program with a virus, essentially a computer virus.
No, absolutely. And where this went off the rails, in a handful of ways, in many ways, was testing on unwitting subjects, things such as LSD and a variety of other substances. Yeah, close. And those subjects, unwitting subjects, it ranged everything from in federal prisons to state mental hospitals.
And that's where Manson comes in.
And that's where Manson comes in, and a variety of other people, who I would recommend people, dig in. Don't settle on just one account. And one of the things that people should also do if they want to read about this is read any testimony that came out of the CIA. And there was some testimony. There were documents written by the Inspector General back in this time period, about 53, through at least officially acknowledged 64. And then the program was wrapped up. Supposedly there were still military programs, others that were still looking into issues related to the use of chemical substances for everything, again, from interrogation to behavioral adjustment. And a lot of these things were funded through cutouts. So you'd set up, again, this is early 50s, mid 50s, early 60s, set up financing vehicles, through, say, what appear to be non-threatening grant programs, from research institutes. So you loop in academic institutions or researchers. And MK Ultra had, at least acknowledged anyway, over 80 academic institutions and others that were either wittingly or unwittingly working on their behalf in various research programs. So yeah, this Midnight Climax program, basically they'd kit out a safe house as a brothel, and they would have the hookers slip LSD or whatever substance to the Johns, and then behind a mirror you'd have like a researcher, right? I mean, this is where it got weird. Sitting there, having a drink and watching these, the hooker and the John have sex, and then they analyzing the impact of the LSD on them in terms of their ability to talk, and would they...
Was the hooker in on it?
Yeah, the hooker was in on it. And
was she an employee of the CIA?
And it wasn't just the agency, like the Army was involved in these things as well. But they would get, cash payments, and oftentimes the get out of jail free card.
Ladies, if you're out
there,
listen to me.
Get around.
Whatever you need.
Come forward.
I'm here for you.
But
there was a show.
There was
talk. You could wear a Boba Fett mask. It'll hide your identity. Otherwise,
but I mean, just imagine. I mean, so it's okay. So this was clearly, was off the rails, right?
Yeah.
And they had one of the guys that was involved in this. It was with what used to be called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. A guy named George White, was involved in like the San Francisco cat house, and according to the stories, he'd sit there with a martini in his hand and watch the couple have sex, and then he would have like prepped the hooker to say, okay, after sex, now this appears to be the best time to get them talking, so ask them about their job and let's see if they'll talk about their job. The idea being, could we influence and entrap potential assets overseas for operational reasons? Was there some use for operational purposes? But basically it was just George getting his rocks off, watching couples having sex, and very, very strange shit. But you're right in that, and so again, this went on till '64. MK Ultra, interestingly enough, not to but Richard Helms was the director at the time in the 70s, and he and a guy named Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of technical services agency, they agreed that the smart thing to do in '73, before Richard Helms left and Gottlieb left the agency, was to destroy all records. So they purged all the records of MK Ultra that they thought existed. This was investigated at a church committee back in '75, and then they found a bunch of financial records, that had not been purged because they'd been kept, audits of, and again, you're talking about like 149 sub-projects. So your sub-project has its own accounting, and you got to turn in your receipts for the LSD that you bought, or the hooker you paid off, or whatever. It's like a receipt, like $12 or whatever you paid for a hooker back then. And so, probably not $12. But they found some financial records, and so that became then a matter of another investigation up on the Hill. And Stansfield Turner, at the time the CIA director, testified at that point. And that's why I brought my laptop, is because Stansfield Turner's testimony is actually pretty interesting as far as MK Ultra goes. And he talks about, we've attempted to group the activities covered by the 149 sub-projects into categories under descriptive headings, wouldn't you? In broad outline, at least, this presents the contents of these files. The headings of the categories of all these various projects that ran under MK Ultra, this gives you a pretty good, quick sense of what they were doing at the time. Research into the effects of behavioral drugs and or alcohol. There were 17 sub-projects probably not involving human testing. This is a testimony from the director of the CIA, Stansfield Turner. 14 sub-projects definitely involving tests on human volunteers. 19 sub-projects, probably including tests on human volunteers. While not known, some of these sub-projects may have included tests on unwitting subjects as well.
While not known?
Well, not known. And then 6 sub-projects, definitely involving tests on unwitting subjects. Research on hypnosis, acquisition of chemicals or drugs, aspects of magician's art.
What, magician's art?
Yeah, like slipping him a Mickey or something. How do you do that sleight of hand? Studies of human behavior, sleep research, behavioral changes during psychotherapy,
motivational studies, studies of defectors, assessment and training techniques, polygraph research, funding mechanisms for MK Ultra external research activities, research on drugs, toxins, and biologicals in human tissue, activities whose sub-objectives cannot be determined from available documentation. Anyway, it goes on, but it gives you a sense of what the hell was happening during this period of time. But again, this doesn't justify it. Obviously it doesn't. But you're absolutely right that to have a full understanding of this, you have to look at the context of what, where we were at the time. And where we were was smack dab in the height and elevation of the Cold War. Knowing that our adversaries, our existential threats, were engaged in this sort of behavior. Now, George White was not really a researcher. He was sitting behind a mirror watching some people, get off. So clearly, and all the unwitting subjects involved. I mean, but look, they were slipping LSD to agency employees without telling you.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's just. Yeah,
it's not that long ago, but we have to think about it in terms of the same way we thought about Abraham Lincoln. That in the context of the times, this wasn't such a horrendous thing to do. They didn't know any better. They didn't know what these substances would do to people, and there wasn't a lot of ways to find out. The Harvard LSD studies that they did, that they believe in part were responsible for the Unabomber. There's a lot of other shit that was responsible for the Unabomber, including particularly his childhood. But they did a lot of these studies because they didn't know. I mean, it's one way to find out. I mean, how do you get responsible human subjects? How do you get people to do? Well, there's not a lot of ways other than just test people.
Right. And unfortunately, yeah, what this ended up being was, like using the most marginalized people out there, like sex workers or prisoners or whatever.
Right.
And oftentimes, Johns are just but that whole thing. But where Tom O'Neill's book is really interesting in a couple of ways if you jump. So MK Ultra kind of finished up in '64 officially, right? That's when the Inspector General came out from the agency and said, "This you got to know, you can't do this." They had a new Inspector General, and they looked and said, "This is clearly not where we are supposed to be." But interestingly, funding mechanisms